one issue that I see coming up a lot right now in culture about disparities and, how that works is, and how that fits, for example, the wealth gap. Is that automatically a justice issue? Is that giving somebody their due? I'm trying to kind of put some legs on some of the things that you've stated there in your framework.
Yeah, so the language these days that's thrown around quite a bit is systemic injustice / systemic racism. Right, that's a term that's blowing up our news feeds on a daily basis. Now, I'm a theologian by training, and so let me just approach the question from a theological and biblical perspective. Psalm 94 says, don't align yourselves with those who frame injustice by statute. Those who frame injustice by statute. What's going on in a passage like that isn't merely individual sin. It's not just, person A sins against person B. It's saying person A is a sinner. He's depraved. If he's in power, he will enshrine his sin through laws and ordinances, through legislation, through systems that treat people like less than the image bearers of God that they are. And so I think biblically, we need to recognize there is such a thing as a category of systemic injustice. And historically, we can recognize there's such a thing as systemic racism. So take the most obvious example to us, which is slavery, which is fundamentally, qualitatively anti-biblical to its core. Why? Because it says, based on my lack of melanin, I'm somehow superior to people with higher melanin levels. And that justifies me treating image bearers of God as if they aren't image bearers. They aren't persons, they're property. That is not just some plantation owner's individual sin. That was systematized in the history of this country. And so, yes, I would argue there is such a thing as systemic injustice, systemic racism. You can move from slavery to Jim Crow. You can move from Jim Crow segregation into redlining. There's been all kinds of sins that have been supersized, we might say, through the power of law. So that would be my definition of systemic sin that's been supersized through the power of law. Now, having said that, the question today, the way what I call social justice B frames it, is the way to spot any systemic sin, systemic injustice, is you kind of leave sin out of the equation, and the defining criteria is if there's an inequity. If there's an unequal outcome, then according to Ibram X. Kendi, who's the author of the now best-selling book, Stamped from the Beginning, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and a lot of Christians are reading Kendi and just soaking it in like a sponge. We need to be discerning here and recognize that his definition of systemic injustice is very different. He clarifies in Stamped from the Beginning that if there's any disparate outcome, the only conceivable explanation is discrimination. And I think that's where things get really dicey, and where a lot of Christians with great intentions get duped into accepting a version of social justice that isn't quite what we would mean from a worldview perspective that starts with Scripture. So, do you
think, though, that disparities in and of themselves are inherently a justice issue? I mean, I think that is an important question, because I think that there's many Christians now who are thinking what we need to do is eliminate disparities. We need to eliminate the wealth gap, for example. But is that inherently an injustice from a biblical perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is no. The short answer is that there's a lot of disparities that have nothing to do with sinful discrimination. But let me give just a few quick examples. So let's take location. If I was born in, say, Appalachia, in the mountains of Kentucky, if I was born in the wilderness of Alaska, if I was born in the Alaskan tundra or the Montana countryside, just by virtue, regardless of my melanin levels, I'm already at an economic disadvantage compared to people born on the coasts. And this isn't just true in 2020. This is true throughout history. If you're born on the Nile River in 2000 BC, you have economic opportunities that aren't available to somebody who's born in the middle of the Saharan desert. And so that's one factor, just location. So think of it this way. In a world unlike ours that has zero discrimination, there will be unequal outcomes based on something as boring and mundane as geography. Mm-hmm. Another example, Asian Americans, the last study that has been reported, their median age is around about 50 years old. The median age of Hispanic Americans is in the 20s. And so if you just take something as simple as that, an age disparity, how many candles are on your birthday cake? Let's ask this question. What's the likelihood that Asian Americans are going to have equal outcomes with Hispanic Americans based on median age? Because there's certain high-paying positions, there's high-caliber careers that in your 20s you just aren't going to reach. And so we could look at an example like that from a social justice B perspective and say, well, that's clearly, anti-Hispanic racism, because look at the vast disparity between Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans. And I would just say, no, there's other factors, what in the book I call less damning explanations that apply in so many cases. Take another one. This is an interesting example from Malcolm Gladwell. He's the author of a book called Outliers and Tipping Point and a lot of other bestsellers. He shows how in the NHL, the hockey league, the National Hockey League, that there's a vast disparity between people born on the front end of the calendar and people born on the back end. And so purely what your birthday is will have a disparate outcome with no discrimination, no ageism, no vicious evil or sin going on, because when little kids are in their hockey leagues at age 7, if I'm born in January and I hit the cutoff for signups versus somebody who's born in December, there's going to be a huge difference in development that's actually going to have an impact for when these kids are being picked for all-star teams with better coaching and things like that. Now, all that's to say, it's an illusion to think that things would be equitable if only there was no discrimination. There are countless examples of inequities that have nothing to do with sinful discrimination. Now, I'm getting into some nuances here that are completely banned from the social justice B conversation. If I were to even cite those in many contexts, I would immediately be branded, a racist, a bigot, a phobic, you name it. But if, as Christians, we're going to be discerning about this, we have to be willing to ask those questions so we can parse out which disparities are the result of discrimination. And for the record, I believe many are. I believe there are disparities and even racial disparities in this country now that are the result of sinful discrimination. But right now, at this cultural moment, those nuances are thrown out the window. And so you have a lot of disparities that really have nothing to do with racial discrimination that contribute to this narrative that everything is racist, everything is white supremacist, everything is patriarchal oppression all the time. And that sends us on a road to a false gospel.
I agree. I was having a conversation with someone and they brought up two things. Like, yes, there are disparities. And we see disparities in nature. So you have different trees. You see disparities in people. You have tall people and short people. I'm 5'9". Krista's of an undisclosed height that is a lot smaller than me. So you see these disparities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a breach against God's moral character. And I think that that's something to consider. do these disparities breach God's moral character? When we look at something like redlining, where it's clear partiality toward a group, that is a disparity that as Christians, we can use our voice to speak into and say, hey, biblically, we have a precedent for not upholding this partiality, for not upholding this disparity. But there are also things that, you know, don't breach God's moral character that are disparities. Another thing that came up recently in a conversation was looking at the NBA and how disproportionate the NBA is for blacks than whites, and how you have, I think it's like 75% of the NBA is like black, something like it's a really high number, and yet black men only make up 6 to 7% of the population. Is that a disparity that we should be talking about if we're going to throw everything into the bucket of racial disparities? Yeah.
Great question. So let me give just a few other examples. In addition to the NBA, you have 22 of the 29 astronauts in the original Apollo space program, 22 of the 29 were firstborn. People living in the U.S. Hey, as the youngest born, you just triggered me. Sorry. People living in the U.S. experience 90% of the world's tornadoes. So if you're an American, 90% of the world's tornadoes are coming after you. Asians are underrepresented in the NBA, NFL, NHL, and Major League Baseball. Women are overrepresented in healthcare and overrepresented in attaining university degrees and in setting consumer trends that determine the actions of the world's biggest corporations. Men make up an overwhelming majority of soldiers who perish on battlefields. Men have a virtual monopoly on bricklaying industry, on the plumbing industry, the carpentry industries. Jewish people are less than 1% of the world's population. They receive 22% of the Nobel Prizes in chemistry, 32% of the Nobel Prizes in medicine, 32% of the Nobel Prizes in physics. And then, you know, the list could go on and on. But the fact is, like you're pointing out, Monique, there are a ton of disparities that really have nothing to do with injustice. And again, that's where the issue lies, is a lot of Christians right now. I mean, take one commonly cited factor. Black Americans are turned down twice as much as white Americans for home loans. Now, based on the tone of this cultural moment, we could easily look at a stat like that and say that is systemic injustice. That is systemic racism. But what happens when you zoom out? You just take one step backwards and recognize the fact that white Americans are turned down twice as often as Asian and Pacific Island Americans for the same home loans. And so if we're going to be consistent, we'd have to say, well, there's systemic anti-white racism and systemic Asian supremacy in this country based purely on the outcomes that are disparate. And so take Indian Americans as compared with, linked up with Jewish Americans, and compare and contrast that with Protestant Americans. The average income disparity, the income disparity between a American Protestant and an American Jewish person or an American Indian person, the income disparity is somewhere in the range of 150K a year income versus about 40K. That's about 3 times as much, that disparity. And so for operating from social justice B premises, we'd have to say there is systemic anti-Protestantism in this country based purely on those disparate outcomes. And so all I'm saying, like, I've spent 3 years deep diving into these numbers, and I would highly recommend to your listeners, rather than just take kind of the headlines that, oh, well, look at the wealth gap between white and black Americans, look at the gender pay gap between male and female, and then automatically jump to damning conclusions. The whole system is patriarchal. The whole system is white supremacist. Do your homework. Because if you don't, you're going to get duped into a version of justice that would have you seeing it in areas where it doesn't exist, And what's important, a lot of people are going to hear me and say, oh, well, Williams is just writing off the reality of racism. Williams is just writing off the reality of sexism in the country. I'm not. I'm saying if we aren't discerning, if we aren't willing to do our homework and get to the bottom of issues, then we think we're fighting the real issue when we're really just boxing a ghost of the issue. And so I highly recommend, Monique, I've been trying to push this on you for months now. Read Thomas Sowell.
Thank
read
you.
Coleman Hughes. Read Shelby Steele.
Thank you.
Read, and also, just to be fair, read Ta-Nehisi Coates. Read Ibram X. Kendi. Read Robin DiAngelo and see on whose side are the facts and evidence. Who's pushing just an ideology and who's citing reality? That's an important question that Christians right now aren't taking very seriously. And so a lot of us are getting duped into an ideology from a good desire, a good intention. We don't want to be racist. We don't want to be part of a white oppressive supremacist system. But we need to do a lot more discernment. And I think Sowell's a great place to start.
I agree with that. And to Tad's point of like justice being giving someone their due, I feel like if people are being given their due and there's still disparity there, we need to look at some other things. We can't continue to say, this is a injustice based on race necessarily. Like what are some, there might be an injustice there somewhere, but maybe it goes down to people's personal choice as well, or maybe there's knowledge that they don't have, or, like something else is amiss. But I feel like so often we come to the table with there's a disparity. So it must be race-based because there's a disparity, like poverty, sentencing, which I'm still kind of on the fence about sentencing, but education, housing, everything comes down to this racial disparity. And I'm not one to say that I don't believe that there are racial disparities at play. I'm just saying that we can't be so quick to jump on the bandwagon of racism, that we have to really investigate and make sure that what we are calling disparities are true disparities. And if they are true disparities, are they breaches in God's moral character?
Every voice